The American dream is still today one of the most powerful myths in American culture. It is an idea which goes back to the very founding of the United States, but which got a particular incarnation in the post-war era where essentially the United States was at the pinnacle of its economic power. What the American dream essentially was the idea that American laissez-faire capitalism was the most efficient economic system in the world, and that enabled ordinary people to work their way up from their own bootstraps and to enjoy the good life, which was defined in a very materialistic fashion as the various consumer goods that American companies were coming up with. So what we want to do in this particular lecture is to explore the historical roots of the American dream, the various ways that the Great Depression and World War II shaped popular expectations after 1945, the evolution of American society after World War II, and how the suburb, the automobile suburb in particular, emerged as the prototypical manifestation of American consumer capitalism. Now, when we look at post-war America, say from 1945 to 1965, this was a period of tremendous economic growth, and this prosperity trickled down so that essentially everyone could get a job, and most people ascended into the ranks of the middle class or had that opportunity. That was the American dream, that the only limitation that you had to being prosperous and free was somehow your inability to work hard. Now, the American dream is a myth because, as we will see, although America was very prosperous, it was not an egalitarian society. There was a gap between the rich and poor. It was also a society that was fundamentally discriminatory in terms of providing different opportunities to whites as opposed to blacks or other minorities. The American dream was also a type of consumer capitalism. It was an economic system that was really unique in all the world, and its constituent elements was, on one hand, an extreme laissez-faire system, where essentially business people, entrepreneurs, and consumers were left in control of the economy. This was very different from post-war Britain or France, where although there certainly was private property and private enterprises, there was a great deal of national planning and state ownership over heavy industries. From the American point of view, laissez-faire capitalism created a system that was more efficient and would create more prosperity and therefore generate more happiness. Now, one reason that the United States went to a more laissez-faire liberal format is because during World War II itself, the society, the economy had recovered and people had become more prosperous. Unlike in Europe, where there had been a considerable amount of industrial and urban destruction, which was going to require a lot of public spending and planning in order to rebuild the economy. But even at a more fundamental level, America had always been distinct from Europe. Its society had been distinctively more individualistic. And this individualism was now, in a way, tailored to by consumer goods companies that were providing new goods to make life better. And this is one of the slogans of the DuPont company: better living through chemistry. In other words, we're going to invent new products like Tupperware and this, transparent plastic that's airtight. You can throw away all your, porcelain that you inherited from your mother or your grandmother, and you can go to this new material that our genius scientists came up with, and you'll be able to have a more convenient way of life. You'll be able to cook for 2 nights and then save the leftovers in the fridge. So there was a very direct argument made by American consumer companies that let us innovate. We'll make new goods even for needs that you don't think you have, and you'll be happy. The other major thing about post-war America was just this move to the suburbs. People left the inner cities. They moved in communities like Levittown. The detached bungalow emerged as essentially the material manifestation of what the American dream was for so many GIs. They wanted to have their own house. They wanted to have their own spread. They wanted to be lord and master of their domain, not have their drill sergeant, or their commanding officer or their mother-in-law tell them what to do. So these suburbs grew out, sprung up across cities in North America. They were white suburbs as well. There was very significant infrastructure of structural racism to prevent ethnic minorities from settling in these white suburbs. And in this society, essentially, there was the coalescence of what post-war America was. If you watch shows like Leave It to Beaver, they exemplify the ideal of what post-war America was supposed to be. Now, in a way, the dream for a better world and a better society was universally felt after World War II. But the context in which it emerged, whether it was North America, Western Europe, or Eastern Europe, was quite different. Obviously, relative to Western Europe, many voters went to the polls to vote in labor parties that brought in socialist measures. In Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union essentially imposed its version of socialism from above. In the United States, there was a lot less focus on government intervention, either in the society or the housing market, healthcare, or the economy. So essentially what was happening is that these kind of legacy institutions from the New Deal, like the central bank or mortgage insurance or Social Security, were kind of left in place. With the American economy hegemonic and recovering very rapidly, there wasn't seen to be a great need for government to get in the way of business people. Just let the economy recover, and businesses will meet consumer needs. Consumers will buy what businesses have, and let the winners prevail. So what we see is that private real estate developers were building these suburban communities. Often government was providing certain subsidies in the form of highways or infrastructure to enable this suburbanization process to happen. The focus was a lot different in the two sides of Europe on the eastern and western flank of the Iron Curtain. In Western Europe, there was a lot more focus on public housing and also universal health care, government takeover of heavy industries. In the Eastern Bloc, the Soviet Union did have a big emphasis on improving healthcare and housing, but it did so largely through terror. And a lot of people were rounded up in, essentially these campaigns of Red Terror, persecuted for their religious beliefs, for their affiliation or their wealth in, a previous era of history. So it was a state that provided material security, but not, the liberal freedoms that were one of the foundation steps of Western democracy. So America's post-war revolution didn't come out of a vacuum. It came out of the experience of the Great Depression, in which many socialist reforms were already implemented. During World War II, it was actually the stimulus of extensive military mobilization lifted the economy out of the Depression. And in a way, people's lives became better. I mean, unemployment virtually disappeared. New opportunities were created for African Americans and even for women to enter the workforce. So as a result, when it came to rewarding those that sacrificed, most of the welfare reforms were focused on the fighting forces, the GIs, the government issues, the men that had gone overseas, experienced the horrors of combat. And the idea is that they would be beneficiaries of government spending. In particular, two things that was done was the GI Bill, which provided for university and vocational training that would enable GIs to get concrete skills that would enable them to gradually enter the labor market and to enter the post-war workforce. Another thing that was provided was government-backed mortgages that would enable returning soldiers to purchase their own home. So the big thrust of returning GIs was settling down. Many of them got married right away. They had children. And essentially, the economy was left to free market forces. Not completely free, because a very significant institution was the Advertising Council, which had been mobilized during World War II to sell war bonds and to get, essentially stir people to support the government programs. Now the Advertising Council got behind the idea that it was patriotic to buy consumer goods. Buying consumer goods would create jobs and stimulus for domestic firms that were transitioning away from wartime production to consumer goods. And in the United States, the recovery was pretty vigorous by 1947. Certainly by 1948, the economy grew very rapidly all the way up to 1968. Then relative to Europe catching up, more competition from Asia, the cost of the Vietnam War, the United States entered a difficult period. This also meant that eventually it would start to adapt a more neoliberal formulation of society, including attacking labor unions in various ways, easing government regulations, spinning off government agencies to the private sector. And America was, in a way, a model for neoliberal reform. And this model was, again, so powerful that by the time of the World Trade Organization, it was essentially the American laissez-faire model that was inscribed into the rules of the world economy. The World Trade Organization was essentially a liberal, neoliberal structure for building, integrating national economies in terms of an unregulated marketplace. So this lecture contains four basic modules. We're first going to look at the historical origins of the American dream. Then we're going to look at the efforts and the ideas and the conditions that shaped the birth of American post-war society. Then we're going to look at one of its prototypical manifestations, the Levittown housing settlement that became essentially the model for the suburb, in which so many young Canadians were born. And finally, we'll go into some evaluations of post-war American society.